So, is the lack of appreciation, what I'm hearing from you, is in the Arabic language in the Quran is contributing to these various misconceptions?
Yeah, actually, very dramatically sometimes. You have, for instance, I'll give you an instance of hadith just to make this point. You have an instance in a hadith where the Prophet tells one of his companions, may peace be upon him, he tells one of his companions to cut someone's tongue off. Literally, to cut someone's tongue off. And this has been translated that way, and people use this to say, look, your Prophet commanded torture, and what kind of, inhumane behavior is this, etc., etc., etc. And when you read the translation, you say, yeah, this is pretty messed up. But when you study the language and you study the historical account, you find when he commanded the cutting of the tongue, the way it was executed was the man who was supposed to get his tongue cut off was paid. In other words, he was running his mouth saying inappropriate things, and the way to deal with him was just give him some money so he's quiet. And the Arab expression, the idiom of that back in the day was getting his tongue cut off. In other words, he's no longer talking trash, right? Now, when you understand the literal translation, as opposed to the idiomatic, the expressive translation, you come to some very dramatically different conclusions. This certainly happens in the Qur'an also. People are translating with no respect to the idioms and the expressions that were used at that time. In other words, standard Arabic standards are being used to translate a classical Arabic text, which isn't fair from a literature point of view. It's not fair and it's inaccurate. And this kind of inaccuracy, first of all, it's something deplorable in any circumstance, but especially when you're talking about a document that is held in such high regard by an entire civilization and is at the center of a lot of the problems of the world today are attributed to this Qur'an, and people's understanding or misunderstanding of it and how it's being presented. So this becomes a very heavy matter. Like the translation of the Qur'an and what it's saying is not a light issue. It's a pretty serious matter, and I hope that as time goes on, our appreciation of translation is more and more sensitive. Because what I'm seeing thus far, which is why I can't really recommend translations too much, what I'm seeing thus far is it shows a lack of appreciation of idiomatic expressions. There's very few translations out there that do that. So
if a non-Arabic speaker wants to learn about Islam, what advice would you give them to how they can learn Quran?
I think for non-Arabs, again, I started by saying I don't recommend translations, but I do recommend good scholarly writing about the Quran that has done some justice to the literary nuances. One of my favorite books, for example, it's called Select Passages from the Quran. It's written by a scholar named Mustansir Mir. His last name is Mir. And it's actually written for non-Muslim audiences. Very simple, elaborate, precise explanation of select passages from the Quran. A good starter book. Similarly, there's a nice book out called A Thematic Study of the Quran. Also well written, because it's not just translating, it's also giving some commentary and some straightforward explanation of the text as it goes along. So books like that I would recommend. For people that are just getting introduced to Islam, I think the best thing to do is to be in contact with a Muslim more than even reading. Because when you're reading, sometimes, first of all, you don't know if it's actually a representation of mainstream Islam or not, because there's a lot of stuff out there. So I can recommend you some things, but you may be reading some other things that may lead you to think that that's what Islam is, but it may not be. And we're living in the age of information overload, and so you may be exposed to a ton of things, which may or may not be an accurate representation of the religion. So the best thing to do is to actually be in touch with a Muslim. And this is going up on the Why Islam site. I think getting in touch with someone through Why Islam would be a smart thing to do. Because these are people that have taken responsibility and will communicate, the right kind of literature to you and be in touch with you and try to answer your questions precisely. But more than anything else, I would say when you do get a question about what you're reading in the Quran, ask a Muslim scholar. And if you know a Muslim who's not a scholar, ask him to ask a scholar. In other words, don't expect that just because someone's a Muslim, they're going to have an answer about the Qur'an. Don't assume that, because you'd be surprised. We don't know our book that much, and we need to we should accept that, and we should say that yes. And even the folks that are trying to deliver the message of the Qur'an and they're trying to learn it as well, when they come into contact with a question, they should direct it to scholarship and to try to get a more precise answer. Inshallah.
So, Brother Nouman, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
That was very beneficial, and I hope the audience enjoyed the questions. And if you have further query, you can call 1-877-WHY-ISLAM. Thank you. You have any